They tried to break me at work on a Tuesday. Morning that felt ordinary until it wasn't. The email arrived at 8:47 a.m. Marked urgent, sent to my entire department but clearly aimed at me. A mandatory review meeting, scheduled for 9 a.m. in conference room C. No agenda. No context. Just my name highlighted in bold at the bottom. Attendance required. I'd been with the company for 7 years. Long enough to recognize when a meeting wasn't about collaboration but control. Long enough to know that when leadership suddenly stopped using your name in casual hallway conversations, something had already been decided behind closed doors. I walked into the glass-walled conference room to find 3 executives seated on one side of the table, laptops open, legal pads aligned like shields. HR sat at the end, hands folded, eyes fixed on the tabletop. No one offered coffee. No one asked how my weekend was. The door clicked shut behind me, and the room felt smaller, tighter, as if the air itself was under review. The VP of Operations cleared his throat and began talking about performance alignment, organizational risk, and forward-looking restructuring. Every phrase was polished, rehearsed, designed to sound neutral while cutting deep. Then came the accusations. Subtle at first. Missed deadlines that hadn't been missed. Decisions I'd supposedly made without approval decisions. I had emails authorizing. Questions about my loyalty. Because I'd asked too. Many questions during quarterly audits. When I tried to respond, they smiled thinly, reminding me to let them finish. It wasn't a conversation. It was a verdict being read aloud. By 9:18 a.m., they'd moved to the real objective, pressure. I was told my role was being reconsidered, effective immediately. I could either resign, quietly with a modest severance, or face a formal investigation that would raise concerns in the industry. The HR representative slid a document across the table. Already clipped, already printed. As if my signature were formality they expected me to perform without thought. I looked at the page but didn't touch the pen. What they didn't know, what they couldn't know yet, was that for the past 11 months, I'd been documenting something far bigger than my own job. I wasn't just an employee in their system. I was the one person who had access across 3 internal platforms that rarely spoke to each other. Compliance reports, vendor payment logs, offshore subsidiary filings. My role existed because they believed no one would ever connect the dots. They were wrong. The breaking point had come last year during a routine reconciliation. A line item didn't match, just a rounding discrepancy on paper. But the source code behind the transaction told a different story. Funds routed through a shell entity, briefly parked, then redistributed in a way that artificially inflated quarterly revenue. At first, I assumed error. Then I saw it again. And again. Different accounts. Same pattern. Billions moving in fragments too small to trigger alerts, but too consistent to be accidental. I'd raised a question once, carefully. During a closed-door review, the CFO had smiled and said, "You're very thorough. Sometimes too thorough." After that, my access was temporarily limited, then quietly restored when they realized they still needed my expertise. That was when I understood. They knew the risk, and they were managing it by managing people, by isolating anyone who might see too much. So I kept my head down and my notes precise. I saved timestamps. I archived versions of reports before they were updated. I recorded approval chains that contradicted public filings. And most importantly, I downloaded a single internal Memo 1 document that tied executive signatures to a transfer schedule spanning 5 years. A document no one remembered approving, because it had been buried under layers of corporate routine. That document was sitting encrypted on a drive, not connected to the company network. Back in conference room C, they waited for me to crack. The VP leaned forward and said, "This doesn't have to be difficult." I looked at the severance number insultingly low for someone they were clearly afraid of and finally spoke, calmly, evenly. I said, "I'd need time to review the terms." The smile disappeared. They reminded me that the offer expired at noon. By 9:45 a.m., I was escorted back to my desk under the pretense of gathering personal items. My system access was revoked mid-login. The screen went black. Coworkers stared and then looked away. By 10:02 a.m., my badge no longer opened the door. Security stood nearby, pretending not to watch me. They thought humiliation would finish the job. They thought fear would keep me silent. What they didn't realize was that breaking me had been their first mistake. Because the moment they locked me out, they confirmed everything I suspected. And because of that one document signed, dated, and quietly ignored, they had already lost control of $6.20 billion truth that was about to surface. I didn't go home after they walked me out. I sat in my car for a full 10 minutes. Engine off. Phone face down on the passenger seat. Letting the shock settle into clarity. Anger would have been useless. Panic would have ruined everything. What I felt instead was something colder and far more dangerous for them. Certainty. The pieces finally fit together. Their urgency, their rehearsed language. The way legal and HR were already in position. It wasn't about my performance. It was about timing. They were racing something, and I had just stepped in front of it. At 10:27 a.m., I drove to a quiet co-working space 3 blocks away. One I'd used occasionally for off-site analysis. I logged into my personal system, connected the encrypted drive, and opened the file they'd forgotten existed. The memo was worse than I remembered. 5 executive signatures. A rolling authorization framework that allowed revenue to be recognized before transactions completed, routed through offshore entities to mask delays and risks. It wasn't just aggressive accounting. It was systematic deception carefully engineered, repeatedly renewed and explicitly approved at the highest level. I made 2 calls. The first was to an attorney who specialized in federal financial compliance, someone I'd consulted anonymously months earlier for a hypothetical. When I told her who I was and what I had, she stopped me mid-sentence and said, "Do not send this to anyone else. Come in now." The second call was harder to a journalist I trusted, one who had covered corporate enforcement cases for years. I didn't give details. I didn't need to. I said one sentence. If a company inflated revenue by billions using signed internal authorization, would that be news? He didn't hesitate. It would be historic. By noon, while my former managers congratulated themselves on resolving a risk, I was sitting across from 2 lawyers who no longer spoke in hypotheticals. They spoke in statutes. Wire fraud, securities fraud, conspiracy. They mapped timelines while I mapped evidence. By 2 p.m., they advised immediate protective disclosure. By 3:30 p.m., the first formal submission was logged with federal regulators. By 5 p.m., the journalist had enough corroboration to begin independent verification. The next morning, my phone exploded. Former co-workers texting in panic. Executives calling from blocked numbers. Emails from the company's legal team marked confidential, asking for clarification and cooperation. By noon, trading was halted. By evening, the headline broke not naming me. Not yet, but naming the scheme. Analysts called it one of the largest accounting manipulations in recent history. The number that surfaced after audits began and filings were compared was staggering. Over $6.2 billion in misstated revenue. The same executives who had tried to erase me were suddenly unavailable for comment. Board members resigned. Regulators seized records. The company's valuation collapsed in real time. Billions wiped out in hours. And quietly, without ceremony, my attorney informed me that I was now formally protected as a whistleblower. The threat they'd used against me, the investigation, the blacklist had evaporated. They had no leverage left. Weeks later, I sat in a different conference room. This one without glass walls or intimidation tactics. Federal investigators asked me to walk them through my process. Not just what I found, but how. Why I noticed the pattern. Why I didn't stop at the first explanation. I told them the truth. Because systems always leave fingerprints, and because arrogance makes people sloppy. They assume no one is patient enough to look. When the case went public in full, my name finally surfaced, not as a disgruntled employee, but as the analyst who connected the dots no one wanted connected. Offers came in from firms that valued exactly what my old company feared: independence, integrity, the ability to see what others ignore. Sometimes I think back to that moment in conference room C, the pen on the table, the silence they expected me to fill with fear. They thought power came from titles and access cards and closed doors. They never understood that real power comes from evidence, timing, and the courage to act when silence would be easier. They tried to make me powerless. One signature proved otherwise.